Joining us now is Ricky Burdett. He is the director of the London School of Economics Cities and the Urban Age program, and we are happy to welcome you to what I think is your first visit to Canada.
I've been here for about 25 minutes.
And how do you like us so far?
Wet and cloudy, but wonderful.
Good to hear it. Your country is hosting the Olympics next year, and I guess we should start by finding out what your role has been in planning those games.
I've been for the last 4 or 5 years the chief design advisor on architecture and urbanism, and it's important that that second word is there because it's about advising the organization, the government organization, which is responsible for building all the venues on how to make a piece of city.
And what do you really hope to achieve at the end of the day?
How to make a piece of city. In other words, I'd like the games to start something that in 30 years' time one can look back and say, if we hadn't had the games in 2012, we wouldn't have people living here in a beautiful park and schools and housing. I mean, that's really the ambition.
You're all about the legacy.
Yes, but I think the games is very much part of that. You can't dissociate the two. Sometimes people talk about, you know, the games and the legacy as if they're separate. No, it's actually one. The whole thing has been conceived that way.
Because you couldn't get one without the other? Is that the idea?
Well, all you need to do is look at Athens and go and see it, you know, whatever it is, 8 years since the last games was held there. And it's depressing because all you see is these rather beautiful structures, well designed by good architects, whatever, but totally abandoned, you know, dead dogs and much else. It's got nothing to do with the crisis of the euro. That's the problem that Athens had. They didn't conceive of it as something that actually would be live and be used after 10 years. I mean, that was the problem. Some cities have got it right, Barcelona, Sydney in part, but I hope we're going to get it a bit more right.
How much public versus private money is going into these games?
Oh, the London Olympic Games is a public-funded event. It's £9.3 billion, so that's roughly $15 billion, which comes out of the taxpayers' purse. I mean, and basically, most of it central government, some of it the mayor's sort of money and budget. The key point here is that will kickstart and already has leveraged in, I don't know, at least 5–6 billion of private funding around the site. And I think, you know, over 20–30 years' time, these sort of figures will equal out.
And again, the idea here being that without the Olympics, that private leveraging would not be taking place.
That is certainly the case. And you wouldn't get the sort of investment in this area of London, which is a tough and difficult, in fact, quite poor part of London. You wouldn't get the interest that there is now already from investors from outside the UK. For example, there's a very, very established investment company from the Qatari royal family, which has just bought, literally a month ago, the Olympic Village. Now, they wouldn't have done that and invested there if it didn't have the sort of kudos around the Olympics itself.
They've bought the village, meaning when the games are over, they get to, they rent it out, or do whatever they do with it.
They will sell the residential units at market rate. And obviously, by that time, you know, the prices will have hopefully peaked from their point of view, in an area that seriously the Qatari sort of investment fund wouldn't touch with a barge pole sort of 10 years ago.
Do you know what they spent to make that purchase?
It's all very, very public. It's in the region of 400 million pounds, so 600 million Canadian dollars.
Very nice.
Yeah.
The urban development that's taking place and transforming London. Describe some of it for us, if you would.
I think you've got to start by thinking, okay, London's a big city and it's got 7–8 million people, and more or less the west side, where Heathrow Airport is and where the country gents live, is the richer side, and it's always been like that. And more or less the east side towards the River Thames opening out towards the North Sea and everything has been for hundreds of years the poorer side. The Olympic Games goes right in the middle of East London, effectively. And it's an excuse, and in a really good way, to make the sort of investment to kickstart a regeneration, but not just architecture and space, but in terms of jobs, in terms of education, in terms of opportunities, in a very short period of time, because actually the whole thing started in 2005, and you know, 7 years happens just like that, blink of an eyelid. In a short period of time, investing, you know, this large amount of public money in a way that you can't measure it. Is it worth it for the 2 weeks in which the games happens next year? Forget it. In that sense, it would be the most expensive investment per minute. But if you measure it over 10, 20, 30 years, then I think it totally makes sense. So that's what it's about, rebalancing, let's call it the social equity of London.
When one tries to embark on that kind of scale over that relatively short a period of time, what have you discovered are the biggest challenges you've run into?
I think kicking people out who have been associated with the area for a long time is one of the big issues. Call it gentrification, call it displacement. And I think you can deal with that. I mean, but you have to have a policy in place which allows you to do that. For example, of the housing that I was talking to you about a moment ago, now bought by the Qatari royal family, 38% is what is known as affordable housing in our country, which means that people on waiting lists with large families, unemployed sort of teenagers or whatever, actually get priority placement in this development. So you need wider political policies. You can't just do it on its own. So the key thing here is that the Games fits into a wider picture of trying to rebalance London, as I described it before. And the mayor and central government have, for about 10 years, had a very clear policy about investing in East London to create jobs and to bring public transport, which I think is essential in this debate. You can't do it.
That was the next thing on my list. Right, okay. Public transit, so what kind of new lines you get?
If you think of London, again, imagine this sort of big ink blot of a city. It's very large. I mean, it's quite dispersed. There are 3 or 4 hotspots of really well-connected places. Some are obvious ones, you know, Victoria Station, Piccadilly, all the big names. There's a place that probably you've never heard of called Stratford. Now, I have to say, until 5 years ago, I didn't know much about it, but it's the 4th best connected hub in London because it has 15 or 16 major suburban railway lines serving the sort of vast hinterland out on the east and where a lot of people come in. But it's also connected to the tube, our subway system. There's also a new line, very important, which in 7 minutes takes you to King's Cross. And if you go the other way, east, and cross the Channel Tunnel, you get to Paris in an hour and a half. So this hub of Stratford is actually incredibly well connected already.
These are all underground lines you're talking?
All the suburban rail are surface, but then as you begin coming inwards, so to speak, then they go down.
It goes under. You've told us about the Athletes' Village and what will happen after the Games to that. What about other major new infrastructure projects? Can you tell us what the plans are for those post-Games?
Okay. Well, I think probably the most important piece of infrastructure is what is green, open space. So in the middle of this site, which used to have 10 years ago, you know, burnt tires, crashed up cars, you know, really pretty depressing backwater of London. You now have, and some of the images which are flashing behind us, you can see an extraordinary park. It looks like sort of Hyde Park. It looks like one of the royal parks. It's really quite beautiful. I was there literally 3 days ago and I was struck by it. So a piece of infrastructure, what you give the future community, that's the key point, is something, yes, it will be enjoyed by, you know, 1 or 2 billion television viewers during the Games itself. But more importantly, it means that if you grow up there and have a family, they will have access to this very high-level park. Around the park, there are 3 or 4 bits of other sports infrastructure which are very important. So there will be a velodrome, there will be a beautiful swimming pool complex, and there will be the athletic stadium itself. But also a school, health center, and places where people work, because you can't just do this without just providing housing. You just get a dormitory. So, for example, the television studios where no doubt you will be interviewing whichever Canadian has won whatever sport, is a massive structure. It's 1 million square feet, so it's one of the biggest structures that you could imagine. It's big studios, just like this black box studios. That's been designed in such a way you can cut it up into smaller chunks and then have other media companies or a university or maybe high-tech sort of industries actually come and use the space in a sort of more adaptive way. That bid for the market is actually out now, so in about a month's time we'll see who's coming up.
One of those facilities that we just saw in one of the pictures that just flashed by looked a heck of a lot like something we built for the Calgary Olympics many years ago. I'm trying to remember now. Was that 88, Calgary Olympics, 1988?
Right.
The Saddle Dome, the hockey arena that all the games were played at. Now, I know these are summer games. Yes, the one that went like this. Do you know whether or not the architecture of that facility was influenced at all by what we did in Calgary?
If it's good, it must be.
Nicely done, Ricky. That was very good. That looks a lot like what was then called the Calgary Saddle Dome, for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I know that's the velodrome that we're looking at over there. That's actually a very, very beautiful design. I mean, the technology is very important in these buildings. How do you actually make a roof which is very, very light? In fact, that building there, the roof was on the ground, and then it's actually picked up with structures, and that's why it has that shape. So it's a technology.
How many will it seat?
That is about 5,000, 6,000.
Okay,
yeah.
So our hockey arena is about 18,000 or so.
Yeah.
There's always an eternal question whenever anybody hosts the Olympic Games. We've tried to do it a couple of times and have been unsuccessful, and therefore haven't had a chance to really answer this question. But at the end of the day, people always want to know, particularly the taxpayers, was this worth it? So tell us, London 2012 will have been worth it if what?
When the fence comes down, literally, you actually feel that you're in a real part of London. And what I mean by that is that that you can walk through a beautiful sort of, but slightly organic environment, because London isn't perfect, that you can bring up kids in a probably better school with certainly better sports facilities than you would have otherwise had. And I guess land values will have begun to match other parts of London and rebalancing out, as I say. Just think of this, if you take the Underground, the Tube in Westminster, which is West London, Central London, where the Prime Minister hangs out, every stop you take as a man and you go east towards Stratford, every single stop you lose a year in life expectancy today. Right? So it's 83 in West London and 77 in East London. Because
of poverty, etc.
Because of poverty, bad diets, all the issues. Now, I think another way of measuring might be, well, if the life expectancy begins to balance out. I think that would be an interesting test in 20 years from now.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
I mentioned the '88 Calgary Olympics, which were a huge success. The '76 Montreal Olympics, which were a success on the fields of play, but financially, which were a disaster, which I think Quebec taxpayers are still paying for all these years later. How much fear is there in London that that could happen here?
Well, I think the contingency sum of the 9.3 billion was so large, it's about 2 billion, that there's been a lot of cushioning because they wanted to avoid that. Where we are literally at the moment is that every single venue has been completed on time and on budget. In fact, we benefited from the recession. And one doesn't normally say this or hear this phrase. Why? Because all the budgets were set before the recession, when the big contractors were building, bridges in the Middle East, or had competitive things to do. The result of the recession meant that actually many more groups, contractors and others, wanted to build these sites, and the prices came down by about 15%. So in that sense, we already know what we owe the government, right? But that was described. It was said. The mayor of London got re-elected, even though we knew that would be the case.
It always surprises, though. The security budget's going to. I know when we did the Olympics in Vancouver, suddenly there was a bill for $1 billion for security that I'm not sure they had anticipated.
No, but let me not. We can't pretend that there hasn't been controversy. The bid in 2005 said something like 3-4 billion. The price is 9.3 billion, right? Of course, it's escalated. But that's also, when you have a bid, you don't think of certain things. Then you put the thing together. But since the day that they started digging, I think that the price is what it's going to be.
Okay, let's finish up on this then. I mean, one of the reasons we wanted to get you in here, besides our interest at how the UK is doing with its Olympic Games, is that we are, in 4 years' time, going to be hosting the Pan Am Games, which are not the Olympics, but it's still a pretty big deal. What can we learn in the province of Ontario from what London has done in terms of planning for something of this scale?
Well, I think probably two very simple things. One is think of it in 30 years after 2015, and what might you want there. And secondly, to make the most of the exact site of where it's going to be. Waterfront, therefore design it in such a way that it feels like a piece of Toronto, but of the future, without it being different, so that the streets are connected, so that everyone can walk through it, so that it feels contemporary, it feels modern, it's sustainable, and all that sort of stuff. But it doesn't feel like an alien thing which hasn't been dropped in. And I think that's, if I half close my eyes and think of what the Olympic site might be like, I'm nearly convinced that it might feel like a piece of London. So I guess that's the only thing I can say, having been here now for an hour and a quarter.
And do you really have to squeeze every nickel you can out of the private sector to make these things work?
Well, in a way, the London story doesn't go that way. Let me stress, there's no private money involved in the building of the Olympics today. There is private money going in as sponsors.
That's what I mean.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's to do with basically funding the event, the
Yes.
logistics of the event, right?
And broadcasting rights and all of that kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
but all that money goes, goes in and comes back.
Because I wonder whether paying for the games, ideally, I remember with the Los Angeles Olympics in '84, the one thing they were extremely proud of, and I think Atlanta '96, is that the games didn't cost taxpayers at the end of the day anything, because they managed to squeeze every nickel out of every sponsor they possibly could.
And what did they leave behind to the city?
Well, varying things.
Yeah, but not substantial. I mean, I'd say the Atlanta games.
Nice park in Atlanta.
Okay, but
some good facilities.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that particularly if you're in an advanced, rich society, despite what we're saying today that we all think we're bankrupt, but respect to the rest of the world, we're up there. We should be investing over time to improve the quality of life of future residents of these cities, and I think that's a good way of doing it. So it's the leveraging in of private money, but with public money in a way creating that infrastructure. It's that balance which I think is what we have to get right.
Ricky, I got one last question for you. People who are listening to you right now will know that that is not a typical British accent. Where are you from?
I was brought up in Rome. My mother was Italian, my father was American, so I'm all mixed up.
Molto bene, signor.
Grazie mille e buona fortuna.
Grazie a lei. Ci vediamo la prossima volta. Ciao.
Grazie. That's nice.